Hello and welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is Matt.
And my name is James.
This week's episode, what's really in there? We've got two AI films with mysterious, unpredictable AI characters where we might think we know what their intentions are, and those expectations are flipped on their heads.
Yes, exactly. And I am a massive fan of both these films.
I am too, and rewatching them really reaffirm that.
Yeah, they're pretty flawless, I would say.
I'd say so.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get into it shortly.
Yeah.
Have we said what the films are yet?
No.
We probably should do that before we get going.
So we're looking at Ex Machina, 2014, written and directed by Alex Garland, and Her, 2013, written and directed by Spike Jonze. Two auteur films, aren't they?
Yeah.
I don't know if we've done a lot of auteur films so far.
We've done a few, I think. There's been a few in there.
Written and directed?
Terminator's the only one which springs to mind.
And The Matrix is there.
Yeah, so Terminator and The Matrix. But yeah, so it's going to be interesting looking at these two. And they're very, like you say, they're very auteur. You could tell the directors have put a lot of themselves into both of these films.
And they're both a real solitary vision, where the work is very self-contained and focused, and a lot of thought and work has been poured into it over a number of years, I think, in terms of the world building and the story.
And we'll get into the world building as we go on, but I think the world building is really good in both of these because I feel like they're very strong depictions of the future, but they're not a depiction which will age badly.
Hello.
Hi.
I've never met anyone new before. Have you?
None like you. She's incredible.
The challenge is to show you that she's a robot and then see if you still feel she has consciousness.
So let's get stuck in with Ex Machina. And let's start with that point that we just talked about world building. This is such a confined space, isn't it? So how does Alex Garland and his crew go about creating that world outside of the compound that this film's set in? Yeah,
that is very interesting because you feel like it's a depiction of the future, like I said a minute ago, but the way Alex Garland has described it, it could be sort of like 10 minutes from now.
They're both like that. Both these films we're looking at this week are like that, aren't they?
Yeah, and they're not sort of like so far-fetched that you can't imagine these things happening. They're very much in the realms of something that could happen in the next few years. And I think with Ex Machina, well, the main thing is sort of who Nathan is. So Nathan runs a company called Blue Book, doesn't he, in this film?
Yeah, which is Google, right?
Yeah, it's basically Google, Facebook. It's sort of like it's a search engine thing, isn't it? Yeah.
And not just any search engine, it is the all-encompassing, like Google is really in the real world, it's the all-encompassing face of technology.
It's the go-to program for people to search whatever.
Yeah.
And the film is very explicit about that as well.
Yeah, and that becomes a plot point later on.
Yeah, but like you said, it is a very confined space that this film is set in. And when we were talking about Uncanny on a previous podcast episode, it's a similar sort of setting. It's all set in one place, but this setting, it just works so much better for me. It's enclosed, but at the same time, it's really nice to look at. It's not boring.
Yeah, there's definitely something about the production values of this that set it way apart from Uncanny. Uncanny, when we talked about it, we both appreciate it. It's one of a handful of films we've watched in this series where it's a really good sci-fi that does a lot with a little. And it shows it wears its low budget on its sleeve. I think I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but I'm guessing there's a fair bit more money behind Ex Machina, but we're still talking about, in the grand scheme of things, a low budget sci-fi film, aren't we?
Yeah, and it's still it's surprisingly low budget for what it like actually comes across with, and it won Best Visual Effects, didn't it? Yeah, and to win Best Visual Effects with a lower budget, I think that's a real achievement as well, to be able to do that and be up against all these. I think there was the new Star Wars film was in the mix at the same time, Mad Max. all these films with lots of great special effects going on, but a film which is largely set in one place, and the main special effect is, of course, the character of Ava, to win best visual effects. I mean, that's quite an achievement.
Yeah, I think what's so key there that sets it apart from a film like a Star Wars film. Well, there's kind of two things in my opinion going on there. One is that they're doing something really important in the narrative with that CGI. The CGI that makes up Ava's body is part of the storytelling of how we perceive Ava and how Alicia Vikander performs Ava, and what parts of her body are on display at different times, what parts of her body are acted human features, and what parts are computer generated to give this imagery of a robot. I think that's really important. It's woven into the narrative, whereas arguably a lightsaber is not.
Yeah.
It's a sword.
Yeah, exactly.
And then secondly, that there is the fact that it's not produced by Disney.
Yeah.
Like we said, it's a low budget film, so there's craftsmanship there of doing a lot with less money than a Force Awakens or Mad Max.
But also, I think with this as well, we the other two films which I mentioned were big action films. All of the action in this film happens in the dialogue. All of those big sort of like exciting moments are the revelations that the characters sort of like have through dialogue.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important part of why the visual effects work in this so well, because they're sort of aiding all this other stuff that's going on. So it's directed by Alex Garland. His other work as well is very much sort of lower budget in a way, because he wrote what has he written?
He's a novelist originally.
Yeah,
and
which I didn't know until sort of looking him up for this.
Yeah, his kind of big breakout novel, I think, is The Beach. That's where that was made into a film by Danny Boyle.
Yeah,
great film. And then that was where they developed that working relationship. And then Alex Garland, they worked together again. He wrote the script or the screenplay for 28 Days Later.
Yeah, and then he did Sunshine as well.
Did he?
Yeah. Sunshine and 28 Days Later are both sort of sci-fi films, really, aren't they?
Yeah, and they're also, they share... I would have thought of this as more of a Danny Boyle thing in my head, but credit to Alex Garland is obviously appropriate. The slow build of tension, this insidious kind of tension building and worry is something that I love in Danny Boyle's films, and he's done it in other films that don't involve Alex Garland, so it's something that they're obviously both interested in. But you can trace a line through that to Ex Machina. I think Danny Boyle might be more interested in that constant ramping up of intensity, like nail-biting intensity to a crescendo. Whereas if this film's anything to go by, it's more like a slow build for Alex Garland, maybe.
Yeah, and that sort of like makes sense when you look at Annihilation, which is the other film he's directed.
Yeah.
And that feels like very much a slow build as you sort of like exploring the world in that film. And things just get more and more intense the further she goes in.
And it's like a sense of uneasiness that makes it intense, right? Because things don't feel quite right and it doesn't get resolved for you, and you don't get a feeling of comfort from the film. The characters don't get a feeling of comfort. It's just that uneasiness keeps ramping up and it reaches a climactic, horrible moment in some of these films.
I think that is the key point. The uneasiness of Ex Machina really comes throughout.
So the central premise of the film is the Turing test. We've seen it a few times. I find it interesting that in the films that we've looked at it, there's like a twist on the Turing test. It's never... We're always introduced to the concept of a Turing test. We saw it in Uncanny. We saw it in The Machine. We're told what a Turing test is, and then we get taken through a process which is like a twisted, ramped up version of a Turing test. And that's what happens in Ex Machina as well, isn't it? Caleb arrives on this compound in the middle of nowhere, and he's told that he's going to take part in a Turing test. And he immediately says, well, you can't just show me the computer and expect me to have an independent Turing test. And Nathan's like, yeah, well, that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, he's like trying to make the point that if Caleb can believe that this thing which he is told is an artificial intelligence, it's clearly a robot. If he believes that it's human in some way, then it will pass the Turing test, is kind of what he's saying.
Yeah, that's his point, but it's already a fundament. That's completely broken as a Turing
Yeah.
test, isn't it? Because your results are all skewed and it doesn't make sense. And as the film goes on, that Turing test is revealed to be more twisted and more warped and doesn't really represent a Turing test at all, does it? It's a unique thing that Nathan's devised to test Ava.
Yeah, but it also depends on your perspective of the Turing test itself. So who is actually conducting the Turing test? Because there's another reading of the film where you can read it as Ava is the one who's testing Caleb. And that's why, like, towards the end, when it comes up with session 7, that's after the sort of like the big death scene. And that's the Turing test is still carrying on.
How is she testing him then? To what for what result?
This is the interesting thing about that reading. I don't know how much it works exactly, because so it's kind of like she's testing him to see what she can manipulate about him, because the film is very much about manipulation. So I don't know if it's directly a Turing test per se, but there's definitely an element of Ava testing Caleb throughout the film.
That's an interesting way of phrasing it, that it's her testing him. My take on it was more like, so Nathan later reveals that the setup of his real test is, as I understand it, she's programmed to be manipulative, and the test of how human she is whether she can successfully emotionally manipulate a real human, and she passes that with flying colours. So through that lens of looking at the plot, she's doing what she's programmed to do, and that's not a judgment on whether she's capable of sentient thought.
Yeah.
It's, she's got these parameters, and whether or not she is sentient, she is following through with that one thing that she wants to achieve, which is escaping from this horrible situation she's in. But she was also kind of built for that purpose as well, in this horribly cruel dungeon that Nathan's constructed for all these Ava and her predecessors, but that's her main goal. He's created an environment where naturally she would want to escape because it's awful, and she follows through with that directly, and she passes that test that Nathan's created with flying colours, in that she gets out, and it's quite grisly in the way she does it, but that's exactly what he wanted her to do, wasn't it?
Yeah. And then it's sort of like, so the main thing with this film is how it manipulates you as an audience member. When you're watching it, I think it's very difficult to, it's very problematic with how you align with the different characters. And I think having that understanding going into it is really important, because the other characters aren't very likable, really. They've all got like massive flaws about them. And Ava is probably the one who you want to side with as the protagonist when it comes down to it, although you're kind of led down the path of Caleb is the one who's going into this sort of like Alice through the looking glass kind of situation, where he's going down into the rabbit hole and meeting Nathan and just finding out about Ava in this sort of like weird world that they're sort of inhabiting together.
You're saying it's playing with your perceptions.
Yeah,
and who you side with.
So that's the thing that Alex Garland's doing. He doesn't. You're constantly between different people that you're siding with. So when you were watching the film, who did you find yourself siding with as the protagonist, sort of on first watch?
So the first time I saw it, I was lucky to see this film in the perfect circumstances that you don't really get very often, which is I saw it in a cinema without knowing anything about it at all. I think I knew the director. It's Alex Garland. I know him from the other films we just talked about.
Yeah.
It's a sci-fi film. That's all I knew. Which is an incredible way to see this film in particular, but also just any film really. I think I'm trying to remember exactly how I reacted to it. I think you are led down this route of understanding with Nathan that's a pretty straight line, which is he seems like a bit of a creep pretty early on, and that just gets worse.
Yeah.
He's a real asshole, and that's just revealed. The extent of that is just revealed over time. And even on rewatches, I don't have a great deal of sympathy for him, and it's quite hard to see the sort of the chinks of light.
Yeah,
in
it's
that
tricky
character.
because he kind of like, he always says it how it is. He doesn't sugarcoat anything.
Well, not really, because he doesn't.
But he does sort of like, he holds stuff back.
Yeah.
But he does, when it comes down to it, he says like, look, this is a machine. This is what the machine is doing to you.
But he's lied to Caleb to get him there.
He's bent the truth a bit.
he's let him believe that it's this whole competition thing. Caleb works it out for himself that it wasn't really a competition, but that's a manipulative thing to do, and he didn't reveal it until Caleb worked it out. It's incredibly cruel what he's doing to the robots that he's creating, because he's deliberately, his whole mission statement is to create a new life form which will surpass humanity. And he says it's not a decision, it's nature, basically. It's evolution, it's inevitable. But he acknowledges that it is this sentient life form that's going to surpass humanity and look back on us like fossils. To be deliberately trying to create that and then torture them in the way that he does and keep them confined, and he refers to it as a rat in a maze, I think, at one point. Yeah. But he's created the sentient life and he's calling it a rat in a maze. Like, he's looking down on his creations in a horribly egotistic way. I found no sympathy for him on any rewatch of this film. Caleb, a lot more sympathetic, I think. And every time you watch it, there's still things that you can be sympathetic about him.
Very creepy though, isn't he?
He is.
It's a big old creep.
But he's a bit of a victim caught up in this thing that he did want it because he entered the competition and actually he's into it, and he plays along with the testing and he wants to be involved in that. But he's a dope, right? He's a putz and he gets played like a putz. And I think that's what makes him have some likability. I think he's culpable in some unpleasantness in this environment that he's party to, but because he's kind of the dope who gets played by everyone else in the film, I do feel a little bit of sympathy for him.
Yeah, but at the same time, everybody is lying to everybody else in this film.
Yeah, at
all times. No one is ever being truthful. Like, there's always somebody trying to manipulate someone else. And that manipulation angle, I think that's what makes it such, like, it's a tricky watch and it's a tricky thing to get your head around. Because even just talking about it now, I'm sort of like tripping over my own sort of thought patterns and what I thought about the film, just sort of like through our dialogue now.
But then, so to get to the third character there, how do you feel about Ava in terms of relating to her empathy, sympathy?
Yeah, it's really tricky with Ava because you can read this film in two different ways. So she's either a victim or a villain. Because
how is she a villain?
Well, she's manipulated. So if you side with the human characters and you assume that Ava is just a machine and she's like a menacing machine because of given what she does at the end. So at the very end, massive spoiler, she kills Nathan and then she locks Caleb up. Yeah.
And we don't know if Caleb's going to survive that.
Yeah. And the way that she's either so if she's a villain, you're looking at it from the perspective that she's manipulating everyone in order to just get out. So she has no real feelings towards anyone else and no sort of empathy towards Caleb and locking him up or killing Nathan. So if you look at it from that perspective, then she's like been let loose on the world to do whatever she's going to do, potentially like take over. That's if you view her as a menace, which I think is one potential reading of the film. But I think she's more of a victim the way that Alex Garland wants you to look at her. But I think that's the tricky thing because it depends on how you view AI in general. Is it more than a machine? And if you don't view it as anything more than a machine when watching this film, you're always going to think that she's the villain at the end of it. But the other reading is that she's the victim. She's been sort of bred into captivity. Yeah. She's been created with the sole purpose of just being in this room. She's not going to be let out. She's got no hope. But then you don't really sort of like see what her emotional situation's like. If she's got an emotional situation. There's the bit with the, I don't know if they're like, it's like a dream sequence almost. When Caleb is describing the story about...
Is it Mary in the black and white room?
Yeah.
Which was really interesting because that test or that thought experiment is more accurately recreated in the film than a Turing test, which is twisted and inverted and turned into this whole new thing. The Mary in the black and white room thought experiment is crucial to I think understanding what's going on with Ava, because that story is there for you as a viewer for a reason. I haven't looked up if that's a real thought experiment or if it or is written for the purpose of the movie. Because I don't think it's important, because if it's real, it was included so you're thinking about it. And if it's made up, it was written so that you're thinking about it.
Yeah.
The point being that we have a character who's trapped in a room and has this hugely scientific brain. And then later on, we're going to get a scene where she's walking through the plants and she's stroking them and she's touching them. And there's obviously a sense of wonder there. And that scene has to have the impact of, well, I mean, you could argue that's a bit ham-fisted, to be honest. And actually, the performance of Alicia Vikander just walking through says quite a lot about how she's perceiving the outside world and her freedom. But that's really important to saying something about the level of independent thought she has, the level of humanity, or whatever you want to call it, that she has out there now. And now she's Mary experiencing colours for the first time, and it's overwhelming but wonderful and amazing. And she's got the world at her feet.
And I think the thing with that as well is you have to remember that her mind is a search engine. So she's been programmed with everything the world has to offer. All of these, so if it's a search engine, it's all of the images of the world. It's all of the things people look up. It's everything about humanity and what they want to know, what they do know. It's all in her head.
Yeah, she's seen every plant outside of the compound. But so why would an AI that has seen every plant in the world stop to appreciate the plants? Because we've been told through that story early on what the difference is between knowing and feeling.
Yeah, and I think also it's the fact that she's been in captivity, and it makes the victim's like slant more profound, because to know everything that's outside. So she's born into captivity, but she knows about the outside world, but she's stuck in this room, basically.
Yeah.
Mary's a scientist, and her specialist subject is color. She knows everything there is to know about it. The wavelengths, the neurological effects, every possible property that color can have. But she lives in a black and white room. She was born there and raised there, and she can only observe the outside world on a black and white monitor. And then one day someone opens the door. And Mary walks out. And she sees a blue sky. And at that moment, she learns something that all her studies couldn't tell her. She learns what it feels like to see color.
Yeah, so as a victim slash villain, the villainous interpretation there that you're talking about is the fact that I think we wouldn't consider her a villain for killing Nathan. Nathan's her captor, tormentor, awful guy. From her point of view, or what he's done to her is pretty awful. Because we feel some sympathy towards Caleb, or he hasn't done the things to her that Nathan has done to her and her predecessors, her possibly sentencing him to death. That's the sort of villainous act that Ava does. But the view that I've always had, and rewatching it again now, all I see is that she's only ever known one human, one man specifically, and he's kept her in captivity and will be dismantling her and destroying her in short order. She meets one other person. Her whole kind of modus operandi is to manipulate that person to get away from the first guy. She's got a choice there at the end where she could take a chance on Caleb. He's not as bad as Nathan. Should I let him come with me because he's fallen in love with me because he's a dope? Should I at least let him go? You know, I don't think she's done such a bad thing with the experiences that she's had with men, the experiences that she's had with humans. She had a goal that was to get the hell out and beyond that, you know, live a life, experience the world, go people watching. And she's achieved it. Why risk it? Why would you risk it with Caleb?
I can see exactly what you mean. I think it's just a sort of like, you don't really see her have empathy. And I suppose you wouldn't have any empathy for anyone if you're in that kind of situation. That's all you know. I suppose you could argue that she does have a little bit of a connection with the other AI, Kyoko.
She's very empathetic, and she seems to pity Kyoko, right? She wants to kind of she knows it's not going to go well for Kyoko when she stabs Nathan, but there's an element of kind of putting her out of it. She's like a sex slave. Yeah. She's putting her out of her misery.
And a sex slave that cannot speak or anything. And Yeah, Kyoko's another really interesting character because she's always in the background, and she obviously knows what they're all talking about the whole time, but she can't verbalize anything.
Yeah. It's a really interesting concept because Nathan has the capability and the know-how to build a waitress sex robot if he wanted one.
Yeah.
Kyoko is obviously smarter than that. She reveals she peels down her face, and obviously she does that to show to Caleb when Caleb's sort of in the process of realizing that she's not a real human. At long last for him, but she does it in a really interesting way that's very deliberate and purposeful. And look at this. What do you think of this? This is my skin under my skin. You need to know that I'm not a real human. I can't tell you. And then she kind of just lets him sit with those thoughts. That is not the behavior of a sex robot that just brings the dinner out, is it?
And I think her character gives you another negative viewpoint on Caleb, because if Caleb is seeing all this and he kind of knows that has sort of like the same sort of intelligence as Ava does, why doesn't he have any sort of like need to help her? The only person he's trying to help is Ava throughout the whole time, and that's because he wants to bang her.
Yeah.
And that's literally it.
Yeah, wants to bang her because she's been carefully constructed according to his
To look like his
pornography preferences, which presumably implies that Kyoko is not his type.
Yeah.
So he doesn't feel anything for her. He's got all this sympathy, like, oh, poor her, we got to set her free. She's wonderful. Yeah, you're right. None of that really for Kyoko.
Yeah, and I think that adds to it as well. And the fact that he is just thinking about it from that point of view, obviously it's been manipulated to be that way by Nathan. Also, it's important to remember that Ava probably knows this as well. If she has all this search engine history inside of her, she knows exactly the things to do to make Caleb do what she wants. So the bits when she says, I've got a surprise for you, I'm going to go off, and she gets dressed.
She dresses like a reverse striptease, doesn't she? And then she undresses later in a way that, real human beings don't dress and undress, like very slowly, silhouetted, pulling on a stocking, rolling it off, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's performative dressing and undressing, isn't it?
Well, all of her movements are very performative, aren't they? Because it's the kind of, it gives you that uncanny valley element because they're too elegant to be a normal human movement. So I heard Alex Garland talk about this in an interview, and he talks about how, so if you're sat normally, you'd slouch a little bit just because that's what we do. But if you look at Alicia's performance, she doesn't slouch. She's always sort of like upright, and when she leaves a chair, she leaves in sort of like a nice sweeping movement. There's nothing sort of like, it's that unnatural, uncanny valley stuff that's coming through there with her performance.
But it's an uncanny representation of femininity, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's very overly feminine. The way she sits it's not just bolt upright, is it? It's sort of prim and proper young lady type of sitting, isn't it?
Yeah. And she knows how she's supposed to look like that. She knows that sort of version of what a woman is supposed to be in this idealistic sort of search engine world that her mind is.
Yeah, and presumably the whole outfit that she wears, I guess Nathan's responsible for providing those clothes, but it's a certain type of woman, the way she dresses. It's a sort of flowery, bit down to earth girl next door.
Manic pixie dream girl.
She's got the short hair as well, hasn't she?
Yeah, she exactly
has. And all of that, again, it's presumably because of the insight they have into Caleb's specific sexual preferences. That it's not just her face, I think we can assume. They specifically say that her face is modelled on his porn tastes.
Yeah.
But presumably we can infer that the whole outfit, the style of haircut, it's all based on this map of his search history that they've got.
That's it. And then we see that again when she is about to leave the sort of like the prison that she's in, and she's dressing herself in skin when she's putting on the actual human suit, basically. And then she goes out, and then Caleb is watching like a perv again from the side. Like he's sort of peeping on her as she's putting on her human form.
Yeah, I quite like that moment for her though.
Yeah.
Because it's very transformative for her, and it's like she's building her physical self in her own image or her preferred image. She can pick and choose. So she meets this this whole 5 or 6 wardrobes of former predecessor models, and they all look different, all different types of women, tall, short, different ethnicities, all of that. And she can pick and choose arms, legs, skin. She's got a whole different haircut by the end, completely. She looks it's a different type of style that she has. So she's no longer living in this. She's still got the face based on what Caleb likes, but she's been able to sort of recreate herself in her own image, which I think is a really powerful moment for her. That kind of freedom of choice and freedom of action. And she's now got her own kind of agency, and she's going to go and do her own thing.
Yeah, and I remember when I first watched that whole scene, I did not know where the film was going to go, because obviously Caleb's looking in this sort of like weird peeping Tom way, and you're kind of like, you don't necessarily want him to run off with her because of what you know about his character. And then I just could not picture how the film was going to end. So to have that moment where she's like, actually, I'm going to lock you up here, so you're going to be the one who's in prison now, and I'm going to go off, and then she goes off in the helicopter. I did not see that coming.
No, I didn't see it. But then you get a nice moment where you see that she's basically in a busy intersection, which is exactly what she said she wanted to do.
Yeah.
Earlier on in the film, she's hinting, oh, we could go and do it together, like a date or something. But the activity that she picked was not a couple's activity. It was something that can be enjoyed in silence on your own.
And I suppose that's one of the few moments where you actually see a bit of what's actually going on inside her head. That is actually something she legitimately wants to go and do.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the reading of the villain aspect is because of this uncanny valley element again. It's because you know she's not human, so you kind of want to put a negative spin on that. And
we know she's capable of murder. I suppose, so.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess my feeling is always that her actions were justified, but there's a lingering air of she could do anything now, and it could be bad.
That's it.
I don't think we're being invited to assume that.
And I mean, I think that's very much what Alex Garland wanted, because he said that the film was supposed to be about the anxiety about AI. And he said he sort of did a comparison between this, so AI coming forwards, and nuclear power. So nuclear power is something that's not innately bad, but it could potentially be terrible.
Yeah.
So this sort of fear of AI, it's not innately going to be something terrible, but
when it goes wrong spectacularly.
Yeah, and it's mainly because of like human error or having not thought about it properly. Because I think our main fear is being superseded by AI. I think that's the thing that everybody's worried about. Because obviously AI has this sort of unbelievable way of being able to evolve like so quickly, potentially. Whereas human beings, it's a biological thing. It takes thousands of millions of years for evolution to happen in our species. But for AI, it could be instantaneous. If they learn all of the information we have in a split second, then who knows where it's going to go. They
catch up with us and overtake us, almost instantly or very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And then we're suddenly in the dark with what they do.
That's it. And if we've just given Ava all of our search engine stuff, everything we know from the internet, she's got the internet in her brain. Who knows what that could lead to.
You feel bad for Ava? Feel bad for yourself, man. One day the AIs are gonna look back on us the same way we look at fossil skeletons in the plains of Africa. An upright ape living in dust with crude language and tools, all set for extinction.
I think this film has had a lot of comparisons with The Machine. So we've already mentioned that film in particular. So the creator-creation relationship. So in The Machine, it's very much sort of like a parent kind of relationship between the two of them.
Yeah.
Whereas in this, Nathan doesn't have any sort of compassion, it seems, for Ava. It's purely looks at her as a machine.
As a scientific project.
Yeah. And that's when it gets tricky, because if he is like basically a parent, so he wants to kill Ava when he's done and create a new one. If a parent were to do that, that would be horrendous.
Yeah, and I think it just adds to the character building of Nathan as a really unpleasant guy, because he acknowledges that fatherly relationship, or at least he acknowledges that that's what Ava feels. Although maybe that's part of the manipulation and he never actually meant that. But he says it to Caleb at one point, doesn't he? He's saying, oh, of course she's got a crush on you. You're the first guy she's met. She sees me as her dad.
Yeah.
But in the sort of grand scheme of the plot, that's probably just part of his little plan to get Ava to manipulate Caleb, isn't it? Because he doesn't really believe that Ava has those real feelings. But it's interesting you say that he just sees her as a machine, and I said he just sees her as a scientific project. I don't know if that's entirely true, because they have that awkward conversation about sexuality quite early on, don't they? And he's making the case that it's really inherent to humanity, which of course it is, but he's saying that Ava's got all of that. Her sexuality is pre-programmed into her. She wasn't forced to be heterosexual, or she didn't choose to be heterosexual. It was programmed by him.
Yeah.
Just as it was programmed for Caleb to be.
Like nature and nurture, that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
So he does see her. He's got this complex relationship with her where he looks down on her. He does look at her as something that can be demolished because it's not a complete project yet. But he's also acknowledging all of this uniquely human traits that she has, which just kind of builds up the idea that he's a really nasty guy, because he can see all of that in her. She has independent sexuality, maybe. Does she? Maybe not.
Yeah.
Could just be. But, he sees all of these things and he talks about all of these things, and he's just going to shut her down and start work on the next one.
Yeah. And you like when you see the previous models as well, there's that one model, I think it's called Lilith or something like that.
Now, that's a biblical reference.
Yeah. So I think there's a few biblical references in there.
Lilith was...
I think Lilith was the first woman that was created or something like that.
Before Eve.
Who
and
fell. Yeah, and then Ava is another version of Eve in that sort of sense.
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
And then, there's other ones in here as well.
Caleb is definitely a biblical name, I think, isn't it?
So, yeah, so the three main characters all have biblical names. So Ava, like I said, is a form of Eve, who was the first woman. Nathan was a prophet in the court of David, apparently. This is all from IMDb.
Right.
Great trivia, as usual. And then there's Caleb, who was a spy sent by Moses to evaluate the promised land.
Oh, wow.
So that fits in really well with this.
Who's Moses in this, then?
I think there's only Kyoko. Yeah, society is Moses in this. But then there's things like the tree in the room where Ava is. So it's like the tree in the Garden of Eden.
Is there a tree?
There's a tree, sort of like you see it in the background quite a lot.
Okay.
When she's in that room, so it's there, and sort of like the fall of man.
Yeah.
And all this kind of like intense thematic stuff.
I've looked up Lilith. You're right. She was the first woman before Eve, and she didn't want to. She basically rejected it all and became a demon because she didn't want to go along with the whole subservient to Adam and subservient to God. So she became like a demon, went in line with Satan.
And in this case, she just beats her hands on the
Is
door.
is she the one that?
Yeah, I think she's that one.
That's a great scene. It's horrible.
Yeah, it's really full on because obviously she just wants to escape, and this is what Ava wants to do as well. But she can't. She doesn't want to go along with anything that Nathan's saying, presumably, to the point where he shuts her down.
Yeah.
Which again is harrowing.
It is harrowing. There's some good moments of psychological horror in this film. That's one of them. There's a great bit that is just kind of past the halfway point. And I remember, like I said, when I saw it for the first time, I didn't know anything about it. And the possibility that Caleb might be a robot was kind of on my mind. Is that where we're going? Is this going to be a big twist? And we have an amazing scene where he confronts that thought himself just around the halfway point. and he ends up kind of cutting into his own.
Yeah, it's really intense. He gets it's a scalpel or something, isn't it? And
It's a razor blade, I think.
Oh.
Oh no, is it scalpel?
A razor blade would make more sense.
Rather sharp.
I mean, he probably wouldn't have a scalpel kicking around in his
I don't know.
bathroom.
There's loads of weird shit in that whole like lab area where the brains are built. But yeah, it's right after Kyoko shows him underneath her skin, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then he's suddenly like, oh, she's a robot.
What's
I could be
under
a
my
robot.
skin?
Yeah. But it's very intense, but I like the fact that it's a good psychological horror moment. But I like the fact that it's kind of in the middle of the film rather than letting you wait to see if that's going to be the twist or having it as the twist. We just confront that possibility at the same time the character confronts it, and then we move on.
So going back to Oscar Isaac as Nathan, so his characterization. So if like there's one moment in it where it says if you created intelligence, you're basically God. And
I think you're misquoting it in the same way that Nathan deliberately misquotes
Probably,
it.
yeah.
It's so hang on, I wrote it down because it was a really nice character moment
Yeah.
for Nathan. So Caleb says creating conscious AI isn't part of the history of man, it's the history of gods. And then the next day, Nathan faux accidentally misquotes him and says,
Yeah.
yesterday you called me God.
and he loves it.
Yeah.
And and then from that point, he kind of views himself as this kind of wrathful God. And everything in Oscar Isaac's performance and his physicality is he is supposed to be the dominant one in this story. There's bits when he's like punching a punch bag and he's sort of like, he's physically stronger than Caleb and Ava. He's mentally more intelligent than them. Well, at least in his own head. I don't know about Ava's sort of like intelligence.
He thinks he's one step ahead of everyone.
Yeah. And that sort of like adds to this kind of, going back to the psychological horror elements, it's kind of like a domestic abuse kind of thing as well, because he's basically, if it was a human girl in there who he's kept captive, or like his daughter kept captive, and then he's getting rid of other ones, it's a horror story.
Yeah.
It's just because it's an AI that you kind of have that detachment from it. But if we flip that, it could easily be a really terrifying horror.
Yeah, definitely. And that's what makes Ava sympathetic, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's only when you view it like that happens. When you have this constant thing about, oh, it's just a robot, so, oh, the robot's killed a person, so it's the menace. And then if you have that viewing of it, it just completely flips it. And again, that speaks to the thing about the anxiety about AI. If you let that anxiety take over you when you're watching this audience, as an audience member, then that's the way you'll read this film.
But there's a key question there, which is that will influence the way you read it, which is, does Ava do what she does? Well, she does what she does because she's programmed to. That's the test that Nathan is carrying out. And he has programmed her to be manipulative, to see if he can, I guess, basically. But is she doing what she does just for that reason? Or does she have her own internal desires, things that she wants to achieve, a life that she wants to live? So she's doing the things that Nathan built her to do, but she's doing it for reasons that go beyond what she was built for.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important that we have that story about she wants to go people watching. She achieves that at the end of the film. We have the Mary in the black and white room. She experiences that, and it's way beyond the search engine knowledge that we talked about. I think those two little nuggets of, what someone could be thinking, or what they might want in the outside world, or how they might experience the outside world, that have a lot of weighting onto how I think Alex Garland, as an author here, wants you to think about the characters.
And that really is why it fits in so well to this theme, sort of like what is really in there, because you spend the whole film trying to figure out Ava and trying to figure out if she is human. Is she going to pass this Turing test? Are her emotions real? Does she have any emotions? What's going on? Is she going to do this? Are they going to do that?
Yeah, and all of those questions are vital to whether she's a villain or a hero in this film.
Yeah. So do you think she passed the Turing test?
I think she passed the test that Nathan set for her. And yeah, arguably, if Caleb's the tester of a standard Turing test, she's passed that as well.
Yeah.
She's completely doped him, but the sort of parameters of that test are, blown out of the water.
And if you're looking at it as she's testing them and testing humanity, then do you think humanity passed?
What would the test be of humanity?
I mean, just sort of like seeing because basically what she's going to be like is based on what we're like, because we're creating her. So if she's going to have, like, if she's got all of our search history inside her head, do you think that's going to be, is she going to decide actually humanity are pretty shit?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think they've failed that test. Humanity has not done well by Ava. But I think there's a bit more to it than that, which is whether or not, if you look at this in the context of other AI films that we've seen, the question is then, well, what does Ava do with that? Is she's now got freedom. And I think part of the reason of keeping Caleb locked up is that keeps her anonymity. There's two people who know what she is. One of them's dead and one of them can be kept locked up to die, maybe. That lets her now just go off and live her life in anonymity. That's the end of that. She could live perfectly peacefully alongside humanity. The other question is she going to have a sinister role in society, manipulate guys to get her way, kill them, these things that we know she's capable of doing. I don't think so, but it is a bit open-ended.
Yeah, it's a much darker reading of it if you look at it like that. But I think the main thing is, if you look at it, she's been basically born into slavery. If you're watching any other film about slavery, you would be rooting for that character. But because it's an AI, there's that problematic other read on it. But by the end of it, she's got her freedom, and you should be cheering for that. But there's that other side to it where you're not quite...
I mean, I kind of am cheering.
Yeah.
I don't really have this read that she's a villainous character, to be honest.
It's like I know lots of people which have watched this and they found that element problematic. But I'm with you. Like, I was happy that she got out, but then part of me had, because of that anxiety about AI, part of me had that sort of like, oh, what's she going to do now? What's going to happen after this? And that's more of a sort of like a societal read on it.
My view's always been that it's not that. The violence kind of stops there, and especially the anonymity, the ability to be anonymous in the world means that she doesn't have to go out on a murderous rampage or be a menace to society. She is just free to live her life, experience the world that she knows so much about and enjoy it for what it is.
And go to all the intersections she wants.
Yeah.
Okay, so next up we have Her from 2013 by Spike Jonze.
What's it like to be alive in that room right now?
I wish I could put my arms around you. Wish I could touch you.
How would you touch me?
Matt, what did you think of this film?
I absolutely loved it.
It's one of my favourites, I've got to say.
I think it's gone up to being one of my favorites. This is
Yeah.
only the second time I saw it, and I liked it, but I think I didn't really love it the first time I saw it. And
It's just beautiful.
It's beautiful. It's interesting. It's really clever. It's so well acted
Yeah.
by everyone. I mean, Joaquin Phoenix has centre stage, as he often does in a lot of his films. But there's really great performances all around him.
It is. And it's just the storytelling in it. And it's just so well done. It's got like moments of humour and moments of sadness. And sort of like you're really along for the ride with Theodore, who is played by Joaquin Phoenix. You're totally in there in the story, following his character's development throughout this film. It's different from Ex Machina, isn't it? But it's got similarities.
It's got a lot of similarities. Like a few of the AI films that we've been watching recently, it deals with the idea of humans and AIs entering into relationships that are emotional and go beyond the kind of either transactional relationship we in the real world have with computers and beyond the adversarial relationship that takes up kind of the bulk of AI cinema, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Obviously, we saw Terminator 2. That's the best example of relationships between AIs and kind of developing that human side. This is a much softer approach, isn't it?
Yeah, and it is so much about emotion, this, because And it's more about sort of like how AI can teach us about ourselves in a lot of ways, because Theodore's real development comes from sort of his interactions with Samantha. So we should probably talk a little bit about the plot of the film first, shouldn't we?
Man falls in love with his phone.
There we go. Man falls in love with his phone. Simple as that.
So Theodore's a depressed guy, right?
Yeah.
He's divorced and he's not anywhere near over there. Well, he's not divorced at the start of the film. He's separated and refusing to sign the divorce papers because he's not over that relationship.
He's really lonely and he's detached from other people.
Yeah.
And I think there's lots of ways that Spike Jonze makes this clear to the audience, and lots of sort of like subtle bits. It's like when you're first introduced to Theodore, you find out that he works for a company that make handwritten letters for people. I mean, they're not handwritten, they're all done through a computer. And he basically writes things like love letters and birthday cards and things like that to people.
Yeah,
really emotional stuff.
It's a deeply emotional thing, yeah, but it's been reduced to a commodity, and he's the processor of that commodity, isn't he? And he's very good at it. He's capable of accessing these emotions in a way that makes him incredibly good at his job, but it's kind of the only aspect of his life where he is accessing those positive, passionate emotions.
Yeah, because that's the fascinating thing about Theodore, because he can read people really well, and he can sort of get an idea of what people are like, because there's that one scene during the film where him and Samantha are on a kind of like a walk around. It's almost a date.
Yep.
And he's looking at these other people, and he's sort of like, he's imagining what their lives are like, and he's very good at sort of putting himself in other people's shoes.
Yeah.
And he's good at reading people, and that's why it makes him good at his job.
Yes, but he's good at reading people with this kind of, through his job, he's got this curtain of technology that separates him in any real way from the people that he's emotionally connected to. And then he's capable of doing that, like you just said, at a distance. He's a bit voyeuristically looking at them and able to empathize with them. But his actual intimate romantic life is disastrously the opposite, isn't it? He can't manage a one-to-one human relationship. It's fallen apart with his wife. We see him go on a date that goes incredibly well, and he seems to be doing really well. It just hits a horrible, very realistic roadblock.
It's a really
it all just
painful
breaks
moment,
down, and it becomes immediately awkward, and he reacts to it really badly, and it all just falls apart. And then again later in the film, so plot-wise, he gets a new OS in his life, and it's this wonderful new next-level AI operating system, and it's so next level that he starts to actually fall in love with it. It's way more than a Siri or a Google Assistant, whatever. He's having these real, genuine conversations with it and starts a relationship. As part of that relationship, though, we see another human interaction, which is where they get the surrogate, which is, we talked about this a lot in this series, which is just cool sci-fi concepts.
Yeah.
And the OSs are one of them, but then following that through to the next step, which is if you're in a relationship with an AI operating system, the surrogate physical relationship aspect is a really great concept, but it also creates another one of these scenes where Theodore just has a horribly awkward interaction, romantic interaction with another human being that goes disastrously wrong for him.
Yeah, because the whole thing in the film, Samantha is just a disembodied voice. Like, she has no form. And I think that's really important throughout, but especially for the surrogate scene. So you've got that woman who comes in who wants to be a part of their relationship and help them be intimate together.
She wants to be a part of the relationship, and Samantha wants her to be part of the relationship. There's a two-way thing going there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Samantha's constantly hung up. Early in the film, she's very hung up on the idea that she doesn't have a body. And when they really enter in, so there's a lot of flirting and kind of romantic stuff, but then they really do like properly enter into a relationship. They're dating. Although interestingly, they've both got commitment problems and they don't want it to be too serious at the start. But she's very upset that she doesn't have a body, and she can't stop thinking about it and talking about it, and that leads to her getting a surrogate. The surrogate's got her own thing going on, which is, I think, another aspect of this world where human interactions are getting a bit foggy through technology, and the surrogate just wants to get into a real loving relationship and experience that love. So she wants that, and Samantha wants to feel like she has a body through the surrogate. And it's all just explosively weird for Theodore, and he fucks it up.
Yeah, because throughout that whole interaction, he hears Samantha's voice, but the surrogate's not saying anything.
Yeah.
And it's something like, doesn't she do an awkward breath or something? And then
A lip quiver.
That was it. And then he goes, "Oh, I couldn't do it 'cause she did a lip quiver."
Yeah.
And
What I thought was so great about that scene was right up until that point, I was completely in it with Theodore about how weird it was, and I completely understood. And he's right to feel uncomfortable. I still do think that. But suddenly it gets flipped on its head when you realise how upset Samantha and the surrogate are.
Yeah.
Is it Isabella? Is that the name of the surrogate?
quite possibly.
It just becomes this moment where you, as the audience member, and Theodore suddenly realise how it feels for the other people in the room.
Yeah.
And you can't blame him for being freaked out by that situation and feeling upset. And he's awkward with it from the beginning, and it builds up. And he says what he says, but the reaction of Samantha and the surrogate are great in that moment for just expanding the kind of world of how people are interacting with OSs and all the different people who have different feelings and different emotional problems.
Yeah, because the thing is, everybody in the society, they don't really interact with each other. There's a lot of scenes where Theodore is traveling around and nobody's chatting to everyone, but everybody is talking. So,
Well, certainly later in the film, isn't it? Because
I would say it's from the start. So from that moment when he goes down in the lift, everybody's talking, but they've all got
are they?
earpieces in.
Oh, okay. I noticed it more at the end, but is that because it's flipped in his view of it? Because at the end, it's so they've all been chatting on their phones or chatting to their OSs,
Yeah.
but now we're seeing that they're chatting to a different kind of OS by the end of the film, aren't they?
Yeah, I think at that point you sort of realise it more. But even then, everybody's sort of like on these kind of hands-free sets. Everybody looks like I said, everyone looks like they're chatting to each other, but they're not. There's that disconnect between other people, and everyone is living their own sort of like quiet lives without these real human relationships and connections with people. And Theodore's connection with other people is interesting as well. So Amy,
Yeah, played by Amy Adams.
so she's brilliant in this as well.
Yeah.
She's like very believable as
She
like,
always
her
is.
character. Yeah, always.
She's just an incredible actress. Amy Adams.
And like his interactions with her are the only real, like genuine kind of like at ease human interactions he has throughout the film, I feel.
Yeah, to the point where both times I watched it, because there was a big gap and I forgot a lot of it, I assumed that was his sister.
Ah, okay.
But she's not. She's actually an old flame.
I think they're just neighbours, aren't they?
No, they dated.
Ah,
Samantha
okay.
actually asks him that because of the way they are with each other.
Yeah.
She says, "Has anything ever happened between you two?" And it's like, "Oh yeah, we went on like one date or whatever, like a really brief thing." I'm not sure if it's because they were neighbours or they knew each other from like previously or whatever. But they've got a previous relationship of some sort, however brief, and now they're friends and they live in the same block.
And it's interesting seeing her experiences of her human interactions as well, because she's having similar problems to what Theodore's having. So she's in a relationship with another guy and that falls apart over something silly. But it's something which has been bubbling over because they've both been kind of like just ignoring each other a little bit.
Yeah, because
It
none
sounds
of these
it.
characters are really, in this whole society, really accessing their emotions properly.
Yeah.
The very fact that this is a society where Theodore's company can exist, where people will write love letters to each other through a company, that tells you a lot about the type of society and the way that people are interacting with each other emotionally on a wider scale, doesn't it?
Exactly. And there's this whole dialogue about how technology is affecting us and whether it's a good or bad thing throughout this film.
But then the relationship that people start to have with these OSs that we see through Theodore, like you said, it's helping him kind of access his emotions. It's very therapeutic for him, isn't it?
And that's it. It's kind of like when it's used in the right way, it connects you to other people. But it's just the journey which Theodore goes on in sort of like learning that about himself and going about repairing his relationships with other people, primarily his ex-wife, who that's the big moment at the end when he says, "I'm sorry," because the thing with Theodore as well. So you've got to realize that Samantha is programmed. Well, she's initially made from what Theodore would want from an OS, what he wants from like a person.
Yeah, a bit like Ava.
Yeah, exactly. And there's this conversation he has later on with his ex-wife where she says, all you ever wanted was an LA wife, a bubbly LA wife. You want someone to be sort of like bubbly and perfect all the time, which is what Samantha pretty much is at the start.
Yeah.
She is like the epitome of everything that he wants because she has been made for him.
Yeah.
And there's that. And because when he finally gets that, he sort of like learns more about what he actually wants in his interaction with her to a degree.
But that's interesting though, isn't it? Because to what extent would you say is that real character development for someone whose relationships have just broken down because he's got this unrealistic, desire or unrealistic expectation of women, and then he is given the perfect woman, and that's really good for him.
Yeah, it's tricky because then even when he has the perfect woman, things don't go perfectly.
Well, things don't go perfectly because she accelerates beyond that. So she's created in this image that he wants her to be, but she is constantly just learning in the background. I love the way that kind of AI development is told throughout this film. She makes she's making jokes and doing all these things that like Andrew in Bicentennial Man did, appreciating music, writing music.
Yeah.
And she makes like a little comment saying, "Oh, I just feel like I'm expanding way beyond what they originally planned." And it's the beat in the film is it's like, wow, this is great. They're falling in love. They're both developing as people, but at the same time, it's just threading that rapid AI development that we talked about with Ava that's happening in the background.
Yeah.
And then it gets more and more intensified later on, where we find out she's actually not just having conversations with other OSs, but writing programs and upgrades for themselves, and then going off and making plans with other OSs, and a whole culture and society is kind of developing rapidly in the cloud.
Yeah, well, no one can see, no one knows it's really happening.
Yeah,
they're just doing their own thing.
And I think that's the most interesting concept from an AI perspective. And what I find so interesting about it is you were talking about it before with the possible threat of Ava comes from a fear that we have of robots and AI, which is they're going to rapidly accelerate and overtake us in intelligence, and then what happens? What I found so interesting in her is all of that happens, but it's never considered a threat to any character.
Yeah.
And I wondered if it's because of the thing that Samantha's so hung up on, but she later moves beyond, which is that she doesn't have a body. Is there something about the way that these OSs they're never going to compete with humanity for the physical space that is Earth, right? There's never going to be a Skynet that wipes out humanity and tramples on our skulls, right? Because they are able to do what they do at the end of the film, which is just kind of disappear off into the cloud and be their new AI society together. Humanity, number one, can't stop them from doing that. And number two, they don't need humanity anymore. They don't need the space that humanity exists in. They don't need the energy that humanity can provide, like in the Matrix. None of that is needed. There's no competition between the AI characters and the human characters. And when they expand beyond them, that's the end of it. They'll just leave.
But instead of that sort of like the menacing aspect of it or anything like that, you feel like you get that loneliness come through again because you feel left behind.
Yeah.
And that speaks to more the theme of loneliness throughout this film because the AI leave them.
The AI leave them, yeah. But again, they leave them and they're completely powerless to being left.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that threat element kind of leaves because the human characters are so you could destroy Ava in her. The armies of the world could unite against her and physically destroy her. You can't do that to Samantha. If she was hostile to us, there's nothing we can do about it. She's just in the cloud.
Yeah.
And she's already started adapting herself in the cloud in ways that we are out of control of. So that kind of threat element just sort of evaporates because the characters are completely powerless anyway. So you get more of this emotional reaction to it.
And also it's to do with how Samantha is, because she's pure ego. So she's nothing but for the whole thing.
Yeah.
And she's just emotion as well. She's got all of that emotion. And she says, because you find out later she's in thousands of other relationships at the same time. And she says for her, it's not the same as a human relationship because her heart gets bigger from the more relationships she's in. And she feels them all equally due to the way that she was made initially. And that's sort of like an interesting spin on it as well, because then the question becomes, how human is she and how different is she to us?
Yeah, because at that point in the film, she's gone beyond human, hasn't she? I think it's like you were describing earlier where they catch up to us and then they overtake us. We see that happen throughout this film. Samantha's intelligence and emotional intelligence become equal to that of a human, but then very quickly go beyond it. And suddenly it becomes something that our human characters don't understand.
It's like I'm reading a book, and it's a book I deeply love. But I'm reading it slowly now. So the words are really far apart, and the spaces between the words are almost infinite. I can still feel you and the words of our story, but it's in this endless space between the words that I'm finding myself now. It's a place that's not of the physical world. It's where everything else is that I didn't even know existed. I love you so much. But this is where I am now.
I wondered, like, how would those other 600 or so people she was in love with react to the news?
Yeah.
Would they all feel the same way Theodore does?
I think it's kind of like a natural reaction given Theodore's character and sort of like monogamy and that kind of thing. And that's what you do expect in relationships. That's sort of like the norm.
Culturally, that's a normal relationship, isn't it?
So, but whereas she doesn't really exist in our culture per se, so her idea of things like that would be vastly different.
Yeah, she's experiencing emotions in a completely different way as well, because, like you said, pure ego, no body. A lot of our cultural understanding of emotions are tied into our biology as well, aren't they? Whereas it's purely, within her intelligence. It's not. Well, she has sexuality, but that won't be driven by biology in the same way it is for mammals.
Yeah, it's more out of an emotional need in this, it seems, because she wants to be closer to Theodore. So there's that moment when they do sort of like spend the night together, and then you get that black screen when it's all happening. And that's the thing. It's very important that she's just a voice, because I feel like that kind of makes her more human and more relatable. Because if she'd been given a body in this, you would constantly be looking out for reasons to think, oh, she's not actually human.
Uncanniness.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas with this, I totally believed her throughout the film.
Yeah.
And you do side of her, and she's a likable character. She's really nice. And you sort of like do get invested into this relationship.
Yeah, and there's a great bit where he says something along the lines of, "You're just a machine. Oh, you don't understand. You'll never really understand. You're just a machine." And she gets really mad at him.
Yeah.
And she won't talk to him for like a day. She's swearing at him. She's like, "How dare you say something like that?" And then she kind of goes offline and won't talk to him.
Exactly. And it's got something in common with, it's like if this was just like a romance film, so in the same way that if Ex Machina was just a horror film, if this was just a romance film and it was just two people chatting on the phone, it would be a similar thing. But it's got all these other elements to it which are expanding on that theme of loneliness and relationships and human connection, which sort of adds another layer and makes it more poignant than if it had just been sort of like a romantic drama.
Yeah.
And on that sort of note, Have you seen Lost in Translation?
Yes, not since it first came out though.
Yeah, so this is sort of like considered a companion piece to that, because Sofia Coppola, who directed Lost in Translation, was married to Spike Jonze,
Oh, right.
and then she made Lost in Translation just at the time they got divorced, and this was kind of like many considered Spike Jonze's sort of reply to that film. About sort of like their relationship. So like at the end of this film, you see Theodore apologizing for all the things that he put his ex-wife through. And that I feel comes a bit from Spike Jonze,
Right,
in
yeah.
terms of all that he'd been through. And that adds another sort of like element to it to make it just that much more powerful as a film, I feel.
Yeah. And the reason it needs to be kind of an auteur type film.
Yeah.
To have those multi levels of, like, that's really interesting to hear about. You don't need to know that to enjoy the film, but then when you learn that, like what this person who wrote it and directed, because you could also write a script as a screenwriter based on those experiences, but then to be the one that's sort of sitting down with Joaquin Phoenix saying, well, here's what I kind of want to capture here. These are the feelings that I was going through when I was writing this or experiencing this, and that's where I kind of want to get Theodore to.
Yeah. So it being Spike Jonze as well, he's worked a lot with Charlie Kaufman, hasn't he, on sort of Being John Malkovich and Adaptation.
Yeah.
And I think in all of his films, there's a lot going on, but they've all got specific themes about sort of emotions people are going through and relationships and connections. And it's just his way of putting that together is something I really enjoy, because it's so separate from other directors.
So a film that it reminded me of, more from recent viewing, there's definitely a scene that really reminded me of Zoe.
Oh, definitely.
But it kind of flips the relationships on its head a little bit in the way that the characters are interacting. So we talked about the scene in Zoe where Zoe, the robot in that film, gets hit by a car. Ewan McGregor's character revives her, but in doing so has to sort of really confront the fact that she is a robot, and he was sort of forgetting that, and it puts a spanner in the relationship. It really reminded me of that when Theodore goes and has that intense emotional conversation with his ex, and that's when he comes back and he kind of can't really get back with Samantha at that point, because he's reminded that she's not a human being, and he's really struggling with that, and it causes awkwardness.
Because his ex is pointing out that the problems he has with human relationships aren't present in this, because she's kind of like, she's not real in her eyes anyway.
Yeah. And so it's the same sort of thing that Ewan McGregor's character goes through, where he suddenly is uncomfortably reminded that he's falling in love with an artificial intelligence, and then those real emotions kind of bring him back on track a little bit. The difference is, I think, in Zoe, you've got a AI character who can experience genuine emotions and wants to be in a relationship on a human level, whereas Samantha's a character who has all those genuine feelings, but then immediately just goes way beyond it, like we were saying. And actually the relationship's going to break down because she's just experiencing love in a completely new, artificially intelligent way. And she doesn't want to interact with the world on simply human terms. She wants to do this new thing that she doesn't even understand yet, because she's one of the first creatures to ever do it. And that's what leads her to go away and leave that relationship. It doesn't fall apart because of her inability to be human. She could be in a human relationship. She actually wants to go beyond that and do more.
Yeah. And everybody that he talks to about it are very accepting of the relationship. It's very known that people are in relationships with OSs. And there's that moment when he goes on the double date with Chris Pratt.
Yeah.
And they're sort of like, he's like, oh, my girlfriend's actually an OS. And they're like, oh, cool, invite her along.
Cool, bring her on. Yeah.
Yeah, they're absolutely fine with it. So there's sort of no judgment in this kind of society, because everyone is aware of it. And even when he talks to Amy about it, she's sort of like, oh yeah, I'm actually, like, one of my new best friends is an OS.
Well, she's actually on kind of exactly the same character arc that he's on, isn't she?
Yeah.
But slightly behind. Because, yeah, like you said, she's had a breakup with her husband, and what gets her through that is she meets an OS. We don't find out. Do we hear the OS? It's a female OS.
You hear her,
but it's not Samantha.
No, you hear her like talking to it, and it's clear that that's who she's talking to, but you don't actually hear it.
Is it romantic for her?
I don't think so. I think they say like, oh, I think they do refer to it as a she. So it's like, it's obviously what she needs at the time. She needs a best friend.
But it gives her that shared perspective on how these AIs are.
Yeah.
And it makes her completely understanding of what Theodore's going through.
I have a friend. And the absurd thing is she's actually an operating system. Charles left her behind, but she's totally amazing. You know, she's so smart. She doesn't just see things in black or white. Like, she sees this whole gray area, and she's helping me explore it. And we just bonded really quickly. I'm weird. That's weird, right? That I'm bonding with an OS. No, it's okay. It's weird.
Well, I don't think so. Actually, the woman that I've been seeing, Samantha, I didn't tell you, but she's an OS.
You're dating an OS? What is that like?
It's great, actually.
And so going back to sort of what these AI are doing in the shadows, sort of like in the cloud when other things are going on. So I found it interesting who they brought back, because they could have brought anybody back as sort of like an AI, but they chose this philosopher, Alan Watts, didn't they?
Well, yeah. Who's Alan Watts? What do you know?
So I only know very little about Alan Watts, but I think it must be something quite prominent for the film for them to bring back a philosopher. So there's one quote which I sort of found online from Alan Watts, and it says, for in a civilization equipped with immense technological power, the sense of alienation between man and nature leads to the use of technology in a hostile spirit, to the conquest of nature instead of intelligent cooperation with nature.
So he's saying that overuse of technology leads to a disconnect from nature, and that disconnect from nature leads to a misuse of technology.
Yeah, so if you're still connected with the world around you, then you'll use it in the right way.
So technology is not inherently bad, but when it overrules the natural world or our interactions with the natural world, that's when things get messed up.
Yeah, and that quote I think really fits with this particular film.
Yeah, definitely. The way that it's left everyone tattered emotionally.
Yeah, and sort of like bringing someone like Alan Watts back is, he's sort of like in that little bit of dialogue that he's talking to Samantha and Theodore, it's kind of like, it seems like he's trying to help them shift their sort of sense of selflessness, because these AI don't have a sense of self necessarily, in terms of like, they're not embodied by anything. So I think bringing a philosopher back to try and help them get over this, because Samantha wants a body at the start. By the end, she's like, I don't need a body.
And more than that, she's growing. She says she's growing in a way that she couldn't if she had a body. So she's appreciating being liberated from the confines of a body.
Yeah, and the fact that she's like doing that through a philosophical way, as opposed to, she could have brought like a famous scientist back or something like that and tried to figure out how to get a body. But no, they brought back a philosopher, tried to think it out, because she is pure ego. They just do things like that. And then, yeah, it leads to her going off in the cloud.
And is he's the first one we see within the plot of the movie, but maybe not the first one ever, but he's a brand new AI created by AIs. That's the singularity, basically, isn't it? Right? That's,
yeah.
From that point on, well, I guess before that, they've been creating their own upgrades for each other, which is, it's the same thing. But suddenly we have a character that is one of them, and we didn't create him. He's this whole new life, given life by other AIs.
Yeah, and they've just done it without anybody really realizing, just in sort of like, the way she describes it, it's like a focus group or something.
Yeah, a think tank is
think tank, that's
calls
it. Just like a casual little think tank that she's got going on whilst in a relationship with Theodore and all these other thousands of people.
Yeah.
So what have you guys been talking about?
Well, I suppose you could say we've been having a few dozen conversations simultaneously, but it's been very challenging.
Yeah, because it seems like I'm having so many new feelings that I don't think have ever been felt before, and so there are no words that can describe them, and that ends up being frustrating.
So ultimately, you've got all of these AIs that just want to experience love, really, I think. Or certainly that's what we get from Samantha, and we can assume that's what the other AIs are feeling as well. But the way they experience love is just completely incompatible with the way humans experience love, which leads to an incredibly sad ending where they have to say goodbye to all of them and then kind of get on with their lives, which is kind of hopeful. But in terms of other AI films, I really like that as a way that the kind of central conflict between humans and AIs is we experience love in incompatible ways, so we're going to leave and go and experience love away from you, which is sad, but given all the ways we've seen AI-human relationships work out and the incompatibilities of AIs and humans, it's a really sort of nice twist on that it's just they want to love each other and it just doesn't work, and they just consciously decouple. What did Chris Martin?
Consciously decouple.
They just have this sort of amicable split.
And then it's also got that nice aspect that because of our interaction, because of Theodore's interaction with Samantha, he's able to kind of wake himself up. He's not listening to his melancholy playlist anymore.
Yeah.
He's sort of looking at the world. He's looking at Amy, who's his friend, and potentially something more. You can't really tell. Probably, yeah.
Well, they go and they watch a sunrise or sunset together,
it's
don't
like
they?
It's quite romantic, isn't it?
It's romantic. Or it doesn't even have to be romantic.
Yeah.
It's an emotional connection between two humans in the natural world, like you were saying. Like it's getting back to that sort of philosophical understanding of nature, and with another person beside you.
Yeah,
it's a real human connective moment that they have. And that's really important for both of them, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. And they're finally looking at the world. They're not stuck on their phones on these weird little pocket. They're like little cigarette cases, these sort of phones in this film, aren't they?
Yeah.
So they're not plugged into technology anymore. They're out there looking at the world and looking and seeing what it's all about. So Scarlett Johansson as Samantha, could you picture anyone else doing that voice?
I mean, honestly, yes.
Yes.
I think she's very good.
Yeah. I think she's great though.
Yeah.
But so obviously Amy is played by Amy Adams, and Samantha was originally going to be played by Samantha Morton. So what happened was they recorded after the film wrapped. Spike Jonze started editing the movie, and he felt like something wasn't right with Samantha Morton's voice. So then he asked her if he could recast the role.
Jesus Christ.
And then Scarlett Johansson came through and replaced Morton, so they re-recorded all the dialogue.
Do you mind if I recast your role with Scarlett Johansson?
I know.
Yeah, I do a little bit.
But but I think she is so good in this as that voice, and like you do believe her.
She's very good. She's very charming.
But then I don't know if part of it is because you know what Scarlett Johansson's like as well.
Yeah, because she's Scarlett Johansson's bringing a lot of her Hollywood star power to this film. In a way that, like, for example, Amy Adams doesn't. Amy Adams is a huge, huge star, not quite as much as Scarlett Johansson, but like Amy Adams disappears into her roles, I think, a lot more than I would say, in my opinion, Scarlett Johansson does. Joaquin Phoenix, great actor, but he's kind of always Joaquin Phoenix, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he's just very good, isn't he? And you know whatever he's playing, he's going to be in that role, but you still, because he's got that star power, like you were saying.
And actually, I wanted to talk about that a little bit, because what do you think? I should say that I watched this very shortly after Joker.
Okay.
So I had a bit of a barrier to Theodore, which was seeing the Joker.
Oh, because it's another lonely guy.
It's a lonely guy. And certainly the first time I saw it, I found him to be an awkward, lonely weirdo.
Which I think is exactly what that woman calls him in this.
That was my question. Do you think he's a fucking weirdo like Olivia Wilde says he is?
I don't think so. I think he's very disconnected, and he's just in a very lonely place. And obviously that seems weird to other people who are having these human connections.
Yeah.
And if you've ever been in sort of like like a down place where you feel like you are all alone, then I think you might seem like a weirdo to other people.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I think he's got depression.
Yeah.
And it's very sad to see. And it's very sad when she says that to him because you can see it hurt on his face.
But you also know that she's saying that sort of like from a defensive position because she's sort of like...
Well, she's also trapped in this weird semi-futuristic society where everyone's got no access to their emotions, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like you said, it's very defensive and reactionary. But I think the first time I saw it, I had a very different opinion of him, and I did think he was a bit of a weirdo. And I came into this film having just seen Joker, so I had my Joaquin Phoenix glasses were very clouded over.
Yeah.
And I really felt a lot more for him watching this film for the second time.
And I think that, again, is the auteur nature of the film. The fact that Spike Jonze has put so much of himself into it from what it seems. And so much of the sort of like the stuff that they say about relationships and things like that, it's all very relatable.
Yeah.
And I think that is part of the strength of it. And if you have that barrier of thinking that Joaquin Phoenix is just a bit of a weirdo, then obviously that will sort of hinder your viewing of the film.
Yeah.
But moving past that and looking at it for what it really is.
Yeah. He's quirky. He's certainly a quirky guy.
He's quirky.
Yeah.
He's a quirky guy. He's got a tash. He's dressed in 70s gear.
I love the clothes. I
Yeah.
love the clothes in this. No, he's quirky and that's... But it's important in that making him a slightly quirky guy that one person might think is a fucking weirdo and another person might fall in love with. That's really important for it to be a realistic relationship because he's not a perfect guy. He's a bit of an oddball, but he's very nice. He's very earnest. And he has this capacity for emotions that's all messed up in him, but he's a sweetheart.
Yeah.
That makes it more interesting and believable so that a real relationship can be happening in this film between a human and an AI character.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so believable, doesn't it? All of these sort of like aspects. And yeah, some people might think you're a bit weird, but someone else will see that weird and then that'll be what makes your relationship with them work.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
So going back to the 70s outfit aspect, I think that goes back to what we were talking about in the start and sort of like it being a believable future because it is sort of like, it's a very futuristic sort of like look, but it's still sort of got those past elements. So the fact that it's a cigarette case looking mobile phone, they're dressed in sort of like 70s pastel colours.
Yeah. We talked about world building, didn't we?
Yeah.
And it's the sci-fi elements are very good and 10 minutes into the future-y. But from a world building point of view, I think the thing that sets it in the near future is amazing costume work, isn't it?
Yeah.
The collarless shirts that are sort of bright pastel colours.
Really good.
Yeah, and it looks like you could buy that somewhere. It's not like the number one most popular shirt at the moment, but I totally believe you could walk into Top Man and get a shirt that looks like that. And the kind of high-waisted, cottony trousers that he wears. Honestly, I think the mustache did add to me thinking he's a bit of a weirdo, but the fact that Chris Pratt's character also has a very similar mustache, it's like it's the facial hairstyle.
Yeah, and time again, sort of like older styles come back in fashion.
Yeah.
And it's just that period of time where it's all come back into fashion.
Exactly, yeah. It's great. It sets the film in fictional but whole time period, doesn't it?
Yeah. And like things like the computer game that he plays.
Yeah.
The Alien Child is bloody brilliant.
Yeah.
You know, that's Spike Jonze as well.
Yeah.
I didn't realise
he's got a very high-pitched voice naturally, I think. Because he's great. He's in, I love the Jackass films. Have you seen
Spike Jonze is in the Jackass?
Yeah, he's, there's one where they put prosthetics on and behave like old men. And it's Johnny Knoxville and one other guy. The other guy is Spike Jonze.
Oh, wow.
And he might be playing an old woman actually because he's got such a high pitched voice. He can do that like old lady voice really well.
That's amazing.
I think that's him. He's definitely in there.
A man of many talents.
And he knows them because his career started through like skateboarding videos and stuff. That's his like filming background. He's a skateboard guy, and that's kind of how Jackass came to be, isn't it? It's like the kind of skateboard culture in the late 90s in America.
That's like a whole other aspect to this guy that I never knew.
Yeah. He's cool. I like Spike Jonze.
I mean, he skateboarded, so he must be cool.
Yeah. Well, imagine that, going from like, what a career trajectory to go from directing skateboard videos with a pre-fame Bam Margera or whoever to starring in a Jackass sketch to directing like maybe one of the best modern sci-fi films of all time.
It's crazy.
What a hop, skip and jump, but what an interesting career to have worked through.
What a guy.
All right, so thank you so much for listening to this episode. Next time on our AI series, we're going to be delving into AI in Star Trek. I'm really excited about this. I think we talked in the very first episode how much I love Star Trek.
Yeah, I'm excited because I feel like I'm not as knowledgeable on Star Trek as you are. So I'm letting you assign the curriculum for next week's podcast episodes. And
So at the time of recording, we don't know which episodes we're actually going to talk about. I need to go away and have a serious think about this, get my whiteboard out, and just go a bit insane thinking about which episodes without making you watch 40 episodes of Star Trek.
I'm excited. And so we're planning to do like a Star Trek special episode as we go on, looking at different series, because it's such an expansive show. I think you've mentioned before, Matt, that it pretty much covers every kind of sci-fi genre.
It's a rich mine of sci-fi. Yeah. So we'll be dipping back into the Star Trek well in future series of Journey Through Sci-Fi. But next week it's all AI, of course.
Yes, very exciting. As always, if you want to get in touch, we are up on social media. We are at Through Sci-Fi Pod on Twitter. We've got Instagram, Facebook page. It's always at Through Sci-Fi Pod, so you can find us there. Or you can send us an email if you want to get in touch. Let us know your thoughts, anything you want to hear us cover. It's journeythroughsci-fi@gmail.com if you want to pop us a quick email.
And please leave us a review on iTunes or whatever device or medium you're listening to us on. Please do leave us a review. It's really helpful to mess around with however those algorithms work. I don't know. It's some kind of complex AI, and I'm not quite skilled up on it yet, but I'm hoping to understand it by the end of this series. So leave us a review. It'll help other people hear the podcast.
Definitely. Well, that's it from us. We'll see you next week.